Ladies and gentlemen, I am Yusril, the game is World of Warships, and to borrow a line, it's that bloody anime again. A busy few days at the start of January let me pick up both of the first wave Arpeggio ships, Kongo and Mukul, and it seemed like a good moment to take stock, have a look at what worked, what didn't, what might be in need of a tweak. And then stuff happened, so here we are almost 2 weeks after I first started writing this video. I'll start with the models. The first thing you've got to note here is a vital caveat. In order to keep people using the Arpeggio ships in the general matchmaking without infuriating the purists, Wargaming have set things up so that if you're not using Yokosuka and you've been placed in a game with someone who has an Arpeggio ship loaded, you will simply see the standard colour scheme. What that means is that the Arpeggio ships have to be compatible with the textures of their regular counterparts, and that in turn means using the same polygon models. That has the most visible effect on Kongu and Haruna, but all the ships will still be using screws rather than the rocket-like motors they use in the series, and the mental models won't be visible either. Starting with Mukul, it's pretty much impossible for me to judge how accurate she is to her paint scheme in the anime. The best I could find were reference images of the Aoshima 1-700 kit done as a tie-in for the Cadenza movie, and that uses a blue-pink scheme with a white band on the funnel rather than the purple-pink with yellow banding that Wargaming have done. But that could just as easily be Aoshima's mistake as it is Wargaming's, and frankly it could also be down to differences in lighting between their source images. I can't say one way or the other without seeing Cadenza for myself. And before you say check the manga for a third source, I did. Well, I checked the first 72 chapters, the rest haven't made it over to Crunchyroll yet. The manga has a couple of decent images of Mukul, but they're not in colour, and they apparently disagree with Cadenza, most notably the placement of the chrysanthemum, and in fact they often disagree with each other on finer details. So going back to the Aoshima model, the markings are reasonably consistent between it and Wargaming's version. The only discrepancies I can see are the position of the chrysanthemum, which is further up and aft relative to the anchor on the Aoshima model, and the absence of the hexagonal plates covering the lateral thrusters just behind it. What is definitely Wargaming's error are the boats and midships on Mukul, which are still in their IJN colour scheme. Whoops. Provisional verdict is therefore a good reproduction let down by a couple of slips, until I can check the basic colour scheme, which, since I'm in the UK, might take a year or two. Moving on to Kongu, it's here that the requirement to use the stock models in-game bites Wargaming hard. The Type C hull in-game, as far as I can tell, is the 1937 refit. The A hull is her original pre-World War I construction, and the B hull her 1927 rebuild. However, Kongu and Haruna both also had a refit in early 1944. Hiei and Kirishima were both sunk at November 1942. And it's this last hull that's used for Kongu and Haruna's Arpeggio models. Leaving aside the alleged 120-odd 25mm anti-air guns, which is probably why Wargaming haven't used it, 2000 DPS at 3 km might be a smidge excessive as anti-air defence at Tier 5, or Tier 10. This refit also added radar and some extra optical rangefinders. Remember when I said that Wargaming probably couldn't alter the base model of the ship? Yeah, here's where it turns into a bit of an issue. Here's the Arpeggio Kongu in-game, and here's Kongu from episode 9 of the anime. Probably the first discrepancy you'll notice is that anime Kongu has a radar grid at the top of her mast, while the in-game version, well, doesn't. More subtly, there's an extra rangefinder here on the pagoda that isn't on the sea hull, and less subtly, no, you cannot have the vertical missile tubes. I'm inclined to give Wargaming a pass on those discrepancies, however, accepting it as the price paid to keep the anime and non-anime crowds playing together. What I'm less inclined to give a pass on is the stuff that probably could have been done as texture and wasn't. Bearing in mind that the waterline in World of Warships is around about here, the panels and lights at the bows should be visible, but they simply aren't there. She's also missing running lights on her pagoda, superstructure and main turrets, and Wargaming apparently forgot to recolour her gun shrouds. They're black in the anime, but they're the usual off-white in-game, and as a result they stand out on Kongu. Mukul's main turrets actually have the same issue, but I'm not sure what colour they're meant to be on Mukul, so I'm putting that one in abeyance for the moment. The good bits? Well, her markings seem to be more or less correct, and the black and grey colour scheme is also more or less right. There is an exception with this particular screenshot from episode 9. You'll notice that the black curves up and behind her personal symbol, but it doesn't do that in other scenes in the anime, particularly in the end credits. Overall, I'd say the aesthetics so far are B+, maybe an A-. They're mostly correct and you have to actually look to spot the mistakes, but they are there to be spotted if you're paying attention. Leaving aesthetics and going on to gameplay, the ladies are essentially a Kongu and a Mukul in their fully researched forms, but with no option to downgrade. Hardly makes a difference with these ships, since there's no reason to downgrade either of them, but if one of them had been, say, a Mogami or an Omaha, it might have been a bit different. You still have to pay for most upgrades, although you do get a fire control system 1 as part of the rewards for each mission. You can also swap the mental models around without penalty between the Arpeggio ships, and you can retrain them free of charge as well. In fact, they don't really need retraining at all, but you can't bring in captains from other nations, so a certain Tsundere heavy cruiser will simply have to wait a bit. Despite being tagged as premium ships, I'm pretty sure they aren't getting the credit and experience bonuses. They're really in a category of their own, somewhere between elites and premiums. From a competitive standpoint, the standard versions of the ships actually have an advantage. Arpeggio ships can't load camouflage at all. While it's a minor issue most of the time, when you're in ranked or competitive play and scrambling for every little edge you can get, it's a definite ding. And perhaps that's the point. If the Arpeggio ships did confer any particular benefit over the regular kind, the purists would doubtless be up in arms at being forced to play anime ships. Looking back at actually getting the ships, it's interesting to note some effects that I observed on my gameplay. The first was during the initial phases of the missions, 30 killing blows on cruisers for Kongu and 30 on destroyers for Mukul. Normally, especially if I'm in a battleship, I don't care too much if I land a crippling broadside only to have the target survive on a few hundred or thousand health and then someone else snipe him during my reload. In fact, I'll often ignore such a target if he's already under fire from someone else, and I'll look for a more efficient use of ammunition. During these missions, however, oh yeah, I cared. I probably cared a little too much on a few occasions when I caught myself either holding fire on an undamaged target while waiting for someone else to put in the opening salvo, or going for massive overkill on a damaged target just to be sure of the kill, even when there was a more efficient use of the ammunition available to me. And to judge by some of the chatter on the EU boards, I wasn't the only one dealing with this temptation. That, by the way, is before you get into the little flare of rage that erupted whenever I did knock a target almost dead, but somebody else sniped the kill. A better approach here will probably be to go with deal X damage to Y class for similar missions in the future. Ignoring the Atlanta as an outlier, York B has 32,000 health, Mukul C has 39,000, Pensacola C has 34,000, so that's an average of, 35,000 health at tier 7. 30 kills works out at about 1 million hit points, but with credits split 2 or 3 ways, how does do 400,000 damage to cruisers sound as an alternative to 30 killing blows? It's got the same overall effect of encouraging people to go after a particular class, but without the toxicity of fighting over the last blow. Credit should definitely go to Phase 2 of Kongu, however, since it got me back into carriers after a while away, at which point I discovered that I'd forgotten how to aim torpedo bombers, but luckily that didn't matter, since I'm currently running an Independence and the fighter heavy loadout doesn't use torpedo bombers. This was actually a surprisingly fast mission. A few games keeping bombers off my teammates got 150 kills almost without effort. and given how long it took to get 300 fires started for Mukul Phase 2, Wargaming could easily have taken this mission to 300 aircraft, or even 500, without adding too much to the load. This, I would say, is an example of a good mission. Not only did it get people back into a class that isn't widely played, carriers in general, but it promoted good teamwork since it encouraged people to run fighter loads in carriers and protect their teammates, rather than charging off and trying to solo targets or raging over stolen kills. Mukul Phase 2 was a bit more questionable. Back in my first video on the Arpeggio promotion, I reckoned the Cleveland was probably the best fire starter in the game, and I still hold that opinion, but not by the margin I did. I'd forgotten just how awful the arc on the American 6-inch guns is, and how much of a shell magnet a Cleveland can be, although that might just be my habit of riding a few kilometres behind the destroyers like a suicidal idiot. I'm also not entirely sure this mission promoted sensible play, since I caught myself firing high explosive even when it might have been a better idea to use armour piercing. While we're on the subject, I should mention Jerryman, who helpfully pointed out that I'd missed out the Mogami in my last video, especially in its 15x155 configuration. So to quickly correct that, 15 guns, each firing 6 rounds a minute baseline, 6 2/3 with basic firing training. The skill says up to 155mm caliber, so they just about qualify, gives you 100 rounds a minute, more or less the same as the Cleveland. 10% chance of starting a fire baseline, 13% with Demolition Expert means you should expect 10 to 13 fires a minute before accuracy and tier corrections. And there's the rub. Before tier corrections. A Cleveland is tier 6 and a Mogami is tier 8, so the Cleveland gets lower tier opponents with thinner armour and worse innate fireproofing, and this means that it probably gets to keep its crown. I'd have said definitely, but Wargaming seemed to have changed the fire starting formula around with 0.5.1, and I'm not sure of the new numbers. Of course, this doesn't take accuracy into account, and I've not driven the Mogami yet, so I can't comment on the 155mm gun's handling versus the 152s on the Cleveland. While I doubt it could be much worse, there'll need to be something pretty special to counter the difference in probabilities, especially if the matchmaking puts you at the wrong end of a 2-tier gap, and you're left staring at tier 10 cruisers and battleships in the Mogami. All that said, I'd have made 3 changes in Phase 2. I'd cut the fire starting down to 100 fires and increased the anti-air to 300 aircraft in an effort to balance the time requirements, although any air kills requirement will always see people reach for the carrier fighters in order to get things done in a hurry, and then I'd swap the phases over. Partially so that people chasing Mukul would have been running air defence, which is a key cruiser role in tier 6 and above, and also so that people going for Kongu got plenty of experience with fire if they hadn't already. Absolutely, positively not to set up burning love jokes. Definitely not. Phase 3, of course, was the same for both ships. Do 1 million damage to the enemy by any means. I just went back to my normal playstyle, mostly in a Fuzu, since I averaged 44,000 damage in that wee beastie, and of late it's been more like 50 to 60,000. It probably didn't hurt that a lot of people were still chasing cruiser and destroyer kills, and I was able to operate relatively unmolested in several games as a result. This was probably the lowest impact of all the missions on playstyle. No priority targets, no restrictions in shell type, just you, the enemy, and 25 odd games, and especially after slogging up through the fire starting phase of Mukul's mission, it barely felt like effort. That brings me to the voice pack, and it's confession time. I called it wrong in the last video. The directory structure for the game does list 6 ships separately for the Arpeggio pack, but what I missed was that the file names are the same for each ship. So yep, you get Iona in your ear regardless of what fog ship you're using, rather than the individual mental models for specific ships, and Iona as the default as I originally thought. It should be noted that Wargaming have never claimed they'd included lines for anyone but Iona, but this promo has been in the works for at least 18 months and probably more. They announced it back at the Tokyo Game Show in 2014. so I have to wonder whether it would have been practical to tag these lines onto the recording sessions for cadenza. It should also be noted that the lines are, unsurprisingly, in Japanese, but you can usually work out roughly what's being said from the game context itself. About the only point where not speaking Japanese costs you useful information compared to the regular announcer is the rough direction given during torpedo announcements, but the HUD indicators generally give more accurate bearings anyway. I have found her welcome as a change to the regular announcer, who I was basically tuning out after so many games, and while I was going to note some bugs in the sound pack, Wargaming have put out the patch notes for 0.5.2.2, which will hopefully fix a good chunk of what I observed, so I'm going to hang fire on that until the new patch is in. So, overall, not a bad start, but this still has the feeling of something that could have been done much better, most notably by bringing in the rest of the cast to voice their individual ships, adding subtitles for those of us who probably ought to learn some Japanese, and tightening up the artwork in several places. As for the missions, I'm not at all convinced that last blow targets are a good idea in a game where kills are almost always cooperative affairs, but Wargaming seem to have developed a liking for that particular kind of mission, with both the Kraken achievement and some of the new European Project R missions serving as further examples of the type. Looking ahead, we've still got the 3 other Kongu sisters to come. I commented in my last video that this felt unbalanced. Seriously, 4 Kongus and 1 Mukul? But as others have pointed out, the commander portraits have a bit of a teaser in them. We've got the 4 Kongu sisters, Kongo, Kirishima, Haruna and Hie, but there are 2 others in the directory, Iona herself, but she's the mental model for submarines, so unless Wargaming have got something very interesting lined up, she might just be a spare commander. The other character portrait is listed as unknown. Unknown my arse, that's Takao. Her ship's in game, it's an Atago class cruiser, but it would mean introducing a non-premium version of the Atago as I discussed in my earlier video. The other possibility, of course, is that Wargaming are pulling a fake out on anyone who goes rummaging through the client. They have labelled this image unknown, after all. Personally, I think it unlikely. Takao is something of a breakout character, and she features more in the marketing than Iona at times. Other possibilities for unknown? Well, this is the end slate from episode 12, using the manga models, well, chibi versions of them, rather than anime ones. Some of them we already know about. Kongu and Mukul are already available. Haruna, Kirishima and Hie are all but confirmed. Iona is, I'm not sure what exactly, and for the purposes of argument we're taking Takao out of the running. Of course, of the rest we can rule a few out, since they don't have models in-game to adapt. Issei, Hyuga, U-2501, I-400 and 402 and Repulse come into that category. Atago and Maya are the same class as Takao, although that doesn't seem to have stopped Wargaming with the Kongus, and working clockwise through the rest from the bottom, Zikaku is in-game as the Shokaku class, and we've seen a lot of her markings in the manga. Yukikaze is a Kaguru class destroyer. It'll be interesting to see if anyone is suicidal enough to division up with her. Yamato and Musashi shouldn't really need any introduction, and they both appear in cadenza, which makes them the most likely candidates for such a fake-out, if anyone could see Wargaming giving away the single most powerful battleship in the game, even for an especially hellish mission or series thereof. The Impossible Astronaut is, well, spoilers. Bismarck is a borderline case, although the Tirpitz model might be close enough for jazz. Nagato is, well, Nagato, but we've never seen that ship in colour, and finally we have the 3 other Mukuls from cadenza, Haguro, Nachi and Ashigara, all of which bring us right back to the problem of having multiple examples of the same ship in the promotion. Although if they do use Nachi, a boosted hydroacoustic search at the expense of not being able to equip defensive fire might make for an interesting twist, and yet another mushroom cloud over the forums. Frankly, my money is on unknown actually being Takao, but we'll find out eventually. The current wave of the promotion has another 5 weeks or so to run, so Wargaming will probably begin trailing the second wave in mid-February. And when that happens, we'll find out just how wrong I am this time. Until then, farewell.